welcome. You can settle in. We're going to start with, my name's Laura Morse. I'm pleased to be here with JASCO Applied Sciences. And this is one of my favorite sessions. You know, what do you do when you have all this data? How do you bring it all together and synthesize a multitude of factors? So we're going to hear a series of speakers talking about this topic of ecosystem linkages and forecasting. And I'm very excited. And so first up, we're going to have Chris Orphanides with NIMS. So take it away, Chris.
Thanks, Laura. So I'm Chris Orphanides from NOAA Fisheries. Today I'll be talking about right whale prey fields in and adjacent to southern New England wind energy areas. And I just figured I'd acknowledge my co-authors there, Harvey Walsh, Jordan Katz, Kelly McBride, and Betsy Broughton, before I get started. So I just wanted to get started with motivation for this talk. I want to note that, as you probably already know, the right whale population is in kind of rough shape as far as abundance. And in 2010, the population reached an estimated 476 animals. Let's see if this works. Oh, I don't see it. That's right. And then plateaued for a while and then lost about a quarter of its population to its current level of about 360 animals. So there's been an unusual mortality event since 2017, and we've seen a shift in distributions since about 2010. And so in the last 10 plus years, right whales have increasingly used southern New England in and around the Massachusetts, Rhode Island wind energy area. So on the left-hand side is a figure from O'Brien et al. In 2022, showing increase in abundance in this region from 2013 through 2019 as far as right whale use. And on the right is an illustration of the heavy habitat use. That one is from the Duke right whale model. That's version 12. Sorry, Jason, there might be a newer one. But it shows the high occupation or density in areas around the wind energy area. So that first right whale abundance graphic, you may have noticed it had vessel strikes and entanglement as the primary risk to right whales, although there's also concern with regards to prey availability. So for right whales, there's a concern that circulation changes brought on by the turbines will change distribution, potentially abundance of zooplankton, maybe change species composition, which could then cascade down to health of the animals in the population. There's a lot of uncertainty as this potential effect, but this is the pathway that something could take if there were significant impacts due to circulation changes from offshore wind development. So the goal of what I'm going to present is to just get a better understanding of right whale foraging in southern New England in order to assess the potential impacts from offshore wind development. So there's a number of study components that we have underway. There's one of the primary ones is net tows. We have echo sounding deployed on a number of ships, video plankton recorders. We recently put ADCP on some of our sampling platforms. We look at stratification with CTDs, energy density, and some eDNA efforts as well. So today I'm mostly going to focus on the net tow aspect of this. I'll talk a little bit about some of these other things as we go along, but just touch on them briefly. A lot of those are still a work in progress. So this presentation leans on two data collection programs, with EcoMon data being the primary one in terms of the results I'll show today. So the EcoMon program, or otherwise called the Ecosystem Monitoring Program, has been around since 1992, but similar data collection programs have existed since the 1970s. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm just going to call the data the EcoMon data when I'm talking about it. So the program collects zooplankton, ichthyoplankton data, hydrography, water chemistry, primary productivity, and even seabird, marine mammal, and sea turtle observations. And the sampling is done with bongo nets, a 61 centimeter diameter bongo net, deployed in an oblique fashion down to 200 meters or within 5 meters of the bottom in most cases. And there's a picture of the bongo net up on the top left, and on the right is the Ecomon strata, which I'll mention in a second. So the other data set, which is more recent from 2020 to the present day, is focusing on Massachusetts and Rhode Island, the wind energy area, and it's also right whale focus sampling. So we had some established stations. You can see some of our sampling locations on the right-hand side there. We have some established stations and some that we adapt based on conditions and whether right whales are in the area. So for this one, we use a converted commercial fishing boat, the Glory Michelle, which is a NOAA ship. And the net tow data that we collected here is incorporated into the Ecomon data as well. So for that, this is where we collect some of the other data with echo sounding VPRs and recently added a ADCP. So the sampling is primarily in the winter and spring for this program. We have done a little bit in the summer. And so for this presentation, I'm going to focus on that winter and spring time period. But the funding, large amount of funding for this is supported by the BOEM Environmental Studies Program. So we appreciate that. So here's just a picture of the study area. And again, in the background are the Ecomon strata. So for this presentation, I'm focused primarily on those hatched areas in the center there. You can see the Massachusetts, Rhode Island wind energy area in green underneath. And unless I mention it otherwise, most of the analysis shown will be for January to April. And that's because right whales do use this area all year round, or nearly all year round. Excuse me. But the January to April is still the time when they use it most frequently for foraging. So the first question is, what species of zooplankton are available for right whales to feed on in the area? So here I've just summarized data from the Ecomon program from 1977 to 2003, and I subsetted January through April. So and the y-axis is the average proportion per tow, and on the x-axis is a species. I've only labeled a few species here, but so the most common one is Centropodes typicus. Calanus is there in the orange bar, the next one over, and Pseudocalanus is in the purplish, pinkish color. So those make up the three primary species, but there are a number of other species, too many to list here for the figure, that individually make up less than 5% on average of the tow, but 50% cumulatively. So next we looked at the data in terms of distribution across seasons. Again, we have average proportion per tow on the y-axis and this time of month on the x-axis. So from the top of the figure, we have the three species. Calanus is up there in the red, and then there's that brighter green is a combined species. So you can see that from January to April, there's some Calanus around, not too much in January, and that the peak of the Calanus as far as proportion per tow is actually in the summer when right whales aren't using this area quite as much. So we're thinking they're probably foraging on a combined number, a combination of these three primary species. And so we also looked at annual changes by month. So on the left-hand side, we have January and February combined, March in the middle, and April on the right-hand side. And these are just the concentrations per water volume. So we can see in January and February, the red line is Calanus. So we have relatively low concentrations for that time period compared to the other months, even though this is a period when there's a lot of right whale. That's where we see the most aggregations of right whales, the highest densities. And we can see some changes across the years, particularly around 2000 or so. So we don't have any data, or at least not much data for right whale surveys in 2000, 2010, which would be interesting to see given that some of the, there might be a slight bump in Calanus in those time periods. And then I'll just transition to, we also looked at the Calanus stage data. So on the left hand, so this might explain some of the right whale habitat use in January in particular. So in these plots, we have Calanus stage data by month, where the higher stages are generally more energy dense, particularly stage 5 associated with diapause. So here we can see in stage 5 peaks in January, where stage 5 and adults are some of the dominant species. And then you can see the kind of cycle through their life cycle through the rest of the seasons here. And this is interesting because we wouldn't expect stage 5 Calanus in southern New England in this area, because we'd expect them to be coming out of diapause in the Gulf of Maine. So it raises the question of where the source of the Calanus is coming from. It's presumed that they're coming from the Gulf of Maine, but this doesn't really work with that hypothesis unless they come out of diapause really early, or perhaps they're swept in from other areas such as the shelf break, so may tie into some things that Glenn was talking about yesterday. And so so it's important, because if the Gulf of Maine changes as far as Calanus, does it change how often right whales use this area in southern New England? So if the supply is from offshore, this area could be sustained. If it's from the Gulf of Maine, the habitat may not be good in the future. We also have a couple other ongoing projects related to this, the energy density piece in particular. So we're looking at approximate energy composition. This is from Amanda Jacobson, and basically it shows a lot of lipid-dense samples in the Gulf of Maine, but because of the shallowness of the water, we have high energy content in southern New England. Also some eDNA work. The interesting piece is that for a very small sample size, it's a pilot program, but for a couple of samples in southern New England on Nantucket Shoals in October, there were actually a large relative density of the eDNA in mysids. So they could potentially be feeding on other things besides copepods, like the mysids on the bottom. We're also looking at zooplankton distribution in the water column with echo sounding. And just to wrap it up, so seems to be a diversity of zooplankton present in these waters, but it's dominated by Centropoges, Calanus, and Pseudocalanus. The seasonal abundance of Calanus doesn't necessarily align with right whale presence, but the life stage does. And there's a lot of variability over time with a lot of these samples, and they're likely right whales are likely foraging on multiple species of copepods, which varies throughout the year, and potentially in some years could be foraging other things on the bottom other than copepods. Thanks for your time.
All right, next up, we're going to have Evan Adams talking about temporal trends in seabirds and forage fish distribution in the Northwest Atlantic.
Thanks for the introduction. Okay. Nothing like a half-full auditorium to get you excited for some speaking, huh? All right, so thanks so much for coming. Today I'm going to be talking about some work that we finished up last year as a NYSERDA project. It's a NYSERDA-funded project, and we really appreciate their support on this. I also want to thank my collaborators on this. This has been there's a lot of different data sets, there's a lot of different thoughts that have gone into this, and so they're all very much appreciated. So as we've been talking about at this meeting, to understand offshore wind's effects on these ecosystems, we really have to get a handle on what is happening in these ecosystems right now. There's a lot of change coming from a lot of different factors, and if we don't get a handle on that, we're going to be left very uncertain about what even effects are happening, let alone what sort of consequences there might be for those effects. And so I think there have been some really great presentations so far that have been focusing on building these linkages, and I think we need to start doing that more here. So we're going to be talking about some components of that today. The other factors, besides just kind of physical changes to these systems, is we have complicated trophic webs in these ecosystems. These linkages among species can create further complexity when we're talking about ecosystem change and create a variety of potential indirect effects. And so if we want to understand what's happening with higher level predators, we have to go back down to lower levels of these food webs and understand what's happening there. So this was our motivating factor for our project that I just mentioned that we finished last year, where we were trying to understand relationships between predators, in this case seabirds, and their most common prey in a group called in the forage fish group. And so this project was multifaceted, and we talked about components of this at previous states of the science. We looked at forage fish distributions, and we looked at, we actually used digital aerial survey data to help give us a sense of where surface aggregations are, which is a really exciting and unexpected outcome of getting a large amount of digital aerial survey data in the region. And they proved to be very useful for kind of trying to understand where these aggregations of prey might be that seabirds are relying on. But today I'm going to be talking about predator and prey relationships more so than kind of those more prey, just solely prey side of things. And we're going to be talking about long-term trends. So how do we specifically, are we seeing trends in either of these two groups of species and how related they are to one another? So this is going to be our compass for how we're going to go about doing this. So while this talk is not really about the methods, I did want to sort of explain our process here because there's a lot of data that are going into this, and it gets a little bit complicated. So on the left, we have forage fish. On the right, we have seabirds. And down the middle, we have our general process, right? We need observations to build, we need data to actually do something with. We need to select some models to help us understand the distributions of these data that are going to be associated with some covariates. Then we have some predictions that we make from those models based on a variety of factors that we include. And then finally, at the very end, we go into, we actually get to do our trend comparisons or figure out what kind of relationships are happening between these sets of species. So let's start with observations and kind of the differences here and where we're getting our data from. So we need long-term survey data to sort of answer these long-term trend questions. Fortunately, NOAA Fisheries does a great job with bottom trawl survey data. They're very consistent, aside from a couple anomalies in relatively recent years. They use a stratified random sampling process to give us really consistent data from these trawl stations year after year. So you can see on the bottom there, over the study period, which was 2000 to 2019, we see some really consistent effort across these areas. One of the issues with bottom trawl data for a lot of forage fish is it doesn't really sample their area very well, the water column. And so after a lot of discussion, we decided that they were useful, but maybe not so much for biomass, maybe more for like occupancy. So we kind of use them in a limited way to understand distributions of these forage fish. On the seabird side of things, the situation is very, very different. If you saw Arliss Winship's talk yesterday, he talked about the seabird catalog and how he uses those data. He and his colleagues use those data in a variety of distributional applications. Essentially, the distribution, the survey data is haphazard. The individual projects have a plan, but like collectively, there is no coherent plan, except for a few like large scale surveys that don't really give you a lot of data in between, like AMAPs or something like that. So we have a lot of seasonal variation in survey effort. We have a lot of annual variation in survey effort. And this all creates problems when you're trying to think about long-term trends and things. But that's the stage we have set. So for distribution modeling, as part of the previous versions of the project, we had done some work with forage fish already, and then we needed to do something new with seabirds. So first I'll tell you about what we did for forage fish, and this is some of Chandra Getch's work, who's now at NCOS with Arliss and that team there, and did a lot of work with using HMSC, which is a multi-species distribution modeling framework that allows you to combine information across species to make predictions about distributions of animals. And so you can see on the left, we have distribution estimates for a suite of pre-selected forage fish species, and then on the right, you can combine them into community predictions. So what we did from here, though, is essentially take those distributional estimates and make them annualized. So we make a new prediction each year so we get a sense of how those trends are changing over time. And that was relatively straightforward because we had done a bunch of work for that already. The seabird side of things was a little bit more complicated. As mentioned, the catalog data are much more messy, and so that left with some challenging options there. Additionally, we are also, instead of dealing with occupancy, we did want to deal with relative density in the seabird data because the count data are very useful. And so, but we wanted to do something similar. So we ended up using Jim Thorson's VAST package to analyze this, which was actually developed more for fisheries applications, but turns out it's actually pretty useful when you have a problem where you have uneven spatial sampling, uneven temporal sampling, you have multiple types of survey platforms, and a variety of other situations that we had with the seabird data. So using that to try to handle that he refers to this as a delta modeling framework. It's a fancy generalized linear mix model. But it tries to isolate all these different types of uncertainty or different sorts of effects on your predictions and help you work through that. But The short of it is we were able to make some estimates for spatial temporal changes in these in a suite of species we selected per season. So we have 4 seasons of models there. I forgot to mention we have 2 seasons of models for the bottom trawl survey because we only have 2 seasons worth of data from that particular survey plan. So now we have our predictions from both of these models. Again, if you want to talk more modeling stuff, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards. Now we have to actually figure out if they're related or not, or what kind of relationships we can tease out from them. So first, we wanted to look at some just broad temporal trends within the study area, which is the northeastern continental shelf in this case. So we want to just compare 2 different trends we have and figure out if they're related, how much relationship we should expect there. Second, we just wanted to look in changes in spatial trends. So changes in center of gravity is really what we're focused on here. So essentially you have a weighted average weighted by the amount of occupancy or density you have in a given cell. You can figure out what the center of that distribution is, and you can watch it change over time and look to see how much it's changing. Finally, then, once you have those things, then you can do some spatial temporal correlation work. We did some spatial cross-correlation estimates to try to figure out how related these things are once you account for spatial autocorrelation in relationships among these different grid cells, just because they're close to one another. So try to account for some of that. So we get to jump into some of our results now. So off the bat, first thing we did was we wanted to look at just the temporal trends and try to simplify them. So we took all these complicated temporal trends and we sort of linearized them. We used a send slope metric to do this, and we tried to estimate we estimated the trend in these parameters as well as our uncertainty in them. And you can see on the top we have forage fish, and on the bottom we have seabirds. The forage fish have 2 different seasons worth of data, fall and spring, and the seabirds have 4. Based on when we have data from them. And so forage fish species tended to be fairly variable in their overall occupancy trends. And so essentially increase in occupancy means increase in the probability that they are found within the study area on average across all the cells that we are sampling. And so we tended to have increases. There was some variation, particularly in spring. We saw more declines than in fall, but there was a lot of variable species trends for these species. Seabird densities or relative densities, on the other hand, tended to decrease almost exclusively, but their uncertainty in these estimates were quite high. This is not super surprising given the amount of uncertainty we have in the sampling scheme for all the seabird data, and really points out that we could use some more consistent long-term seabird sampling efforts in the region for sure. Spring was the season with the most declines with seabirds. But they were found declines were found in other seasons as well, but certainly not in all seasons and not in all species. So if we want to look at spatial trends, so now with these trend maps we have change in latitude on the y and change in longitude on the x, and so just you can kind of imagine these as where the population or where that distribution of animals is drifting over the 2001 to 2019 study period. On the left, we have the forage fish distributions. On the right, we have the seabird distributions. So first thing that's worth pointing out here is that the seabird distributions are an order of magnitude more significant in their drift than forage fish distributions. They also have about an order of magnitude more uncertainty, actually probably even more than that. And so there's a lot of variance in these estimates over. Across these seasons. Forage fish, you see a lot of variability in where their distributions are shifting towards, and particularly in fall, there's some southeast, there's some moving to the northwest, but in the spring they tend to be moving to the southwest. For seabirds, there's actually quite a bit of seasonal variation, as you can see. Summer, you can tell there's very little shift, which likely indicates, that's their most of our species' breeding seasons for this study, and they're not really moving very quickly during the breeding season, likely because they're linked to breeding grounds. But in the fall, and in the winter in particular, fall, we're seeing a strong northeasterly shift, and in the winter, we're seeing a strong southwesterly shift. If we want to do some trend comparisons, this is what our trends look like over time for these species. We can look at some correlations between these. I will say there's a lot of high correlations, but there's not a lot of strong correlations because we have a lot of uncertainty. So there's not a lot of really strong correlations here that we can write home about, particularly on the positive side where we're seeing strong connections between forage fish and seabirds. If we go to spring, you see kind of a similar pattern, a lot of negative relationships. Essentially, the forage fish that are going up and the seabirds that are going down tend to be correlated with each other. But we're not coming away with like a really strong relationships, likely because we have a ton of uncertainty in our seabird distributions in particular, or because we are measuring forage fish occupancy and not biomass, and biomass is probably the thing that matters more. So we need to do some more work there. Finally, we do see some changes in like correlations over space. Particularly, there seems to be some relationships with like species shifting their distributions to be around Medhaven more, but I don't have a ton of time to talk about that. So, seems like there's a lot of change in these systems. We have a lot of uncertainty in our measuring techniques, but there's a lot of variance in these distributions. We need to understand more about these things. We need more focused seabird surveys. We need better estimates of forage fish densities at site scales and at broader scales. They don't get picked up in a lot of these surveys very well. So, I think we need to do more work on trophic relationships generally, and that's probably all I got. So, cheers.
All right, next up, we're going to have Nathan Hirtle talking about modeling distribution shifts of small odontocetes in the Northeast United States.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Nathan Hirtle. I'm a PhD candidate in Dr. Leslie Thorne's lab here at Stony Brook University, and I'm excited on behalf of my collaborators to talk to you about my work modeling the distribution shifts of small odontocetes in the Northeast U.S. So, as we've heard ad nauseum, this conference, the Northeast U.S. is warming very, very rapidly. You can see in sub-panel B, that really bright red, it's warming faster than almost 99% of the rest of the world's marine ecosystems. And of course, as again, we've heard throughout this conference, there's really big questions about how that's going to affect the ecosystem at large. And as our keynote speaker yesterday told us, there was a pretty significant Gulf Stream shift in 2008 in consequence with a lot of other changes that have been going on decadally. And I just want to sort of zoom in here on the Mid-Atlantic Bight and the Gulf of Maine. And we've heard already just in this session about how that's affected forage fish, how it's affected right whales, and I'm going to tell you about how that's affected our small odontocetes, those small toothed whales, delphinids, and porpoise species. And so in the Thorne Lab, we published recently, in 2022, we published a paper looking at how trends in stranding patterns of small odontocete species have changed over time in the Northeast U.S. And so here's a figure from the supplemental of that paper where we related sea surface temperature anomaly to the relative proportions of strandings of several species here in the Northeast U.S. So there's 6 species here. I just want you to focus on the harbor porpoise on the top, which, very important to note, they are a cool water species, and short-beaked common dolphins on the bottom in the goldenrod. And so, not really unexpectedly, as sea surface temperature anomaly increases, you sort of tend to see an increase in the relative proportion of short-beaked common dolphin strandings. And again, unsurprisingly, sort of the opposite trend for harbor porpoises. And this is really interesting, right? It suggests maybe a potential change or a dependence in habitat use as a function of sea surface temperature. But it's a very coarse metric, right? It's just telling us about the Northeast U.S. in general. And so if you really want to figure out, habitat use at a really fine scale, we have to learn about their at-sea distributions, as you guys have already heard about with Evan's talk, Chris's talk, and Arlissa's excellent talk yesterday. And so that's exactly what my project aimed to do. And so in doing so, I constructed species distribution models for 6 small odontocete species in the Northeast U.S., and then I described the model changes in their distributions over time. And then in the context of this conference, right, determine, okay, does that core habitat, does it overlap with current and or future wind lease areas, and what might that mean for potential management and human-wildlife interactions? So like I mentioned, I focused on 6 study species here, but I'm just going to keep it familiar and keep us with the cool water harbor porpoises and the short-beaked common dolphins as they sort of showed contrasting patterns. I think it's interesting to compare them. And so, of course, in building distribution models, the first thing we need is a bunch of abundance data. And so we have line intrinsic survey data as far back as, I think, 1992. This map here represents almost 3.1 million kilometers of line intrinsic survey data. And so I just, again, want to give a bunch of thanks to the people who have collected that data out on the boats and the planes, and also the people who correct those data and make it so that I can use that data for the work that I'm doing here. It takes a ton of work before I even see the data, and so I'm very grateful. And so once I have those abundance data, I relate those to oceanographic covariates, things like sea surface temperature, the mixed layer depth, salinity, things like that. And then the modeling framework that I'm using is generalized additive models, sort of a very common distribution modeling approach. And as is always the case, figuring out the specifications of these models, the really fine-tuned details, the nitty-gritty of the code, has been one hell of a journey, to be honest. And so that I'm actually in the middle of writing up a paper right now, sort of describing how to use GAMs to do this, because, like I said, it's been quite difficult. And so I'm very excited about it. I'm happy to answer questions about it. But for today, I thought we'd look at some fancy maps. And so really the results from these models is looking at predictive maps, and as I mentioned, looking at how those distributions may have changed over time. And here, just the color represents the brighter yellows represent higher abundance or densities for, in this case, short-beak common dolphins. So before we get into the statistics and specific trends, I just kind of wanted to zoom in on the predictions and orient you. So you'll notice here I'm iterating through 4 different year bins, and the reason for these year bins is that these year bins are actually included as factors in the model. And what that means is that those species-environment relationships are allowed to vary slightly over time. So in the first year bin, it might be a little bit to the left, and the second year bin might be a little bit to the right, so on and so forth. And it also sort of makes it easier to look at how those changes have occurred over time. And so here, for short-beak common dolphins, we're going to start back at the beginning. You'll notice pretty high abundance down near Cape Hatteras. They kind of slosh up the coast, stay pretty high up the shelf break. And then in the latest year bin, you notice their abundance is actually highest sort of near George's Bank. And so sort of without even looking at the summary statistics, we can see how their distributions have sort of traveled up the coast in the past 25 years or so. But of course, we have to summarize those data somehow. And sort of the simplest way to do that is to just look at the centroid. So it's kind of the spatially averaged, abundance-weighted center mass of their distributions. But then, of course, also the trailing edge of their distribution is important, right? So these animals that are spending the time furthest south. And so we don't necessarily expect those two summary metrics to change at the same rate or change at all, to be honest. And so when we plot these summary statistics over time, this time looking at it annually, here the circles represent that centroid and the triangles represent the trailing edge of the short-beak common dolphins, and each panel representing a different season. You can see pretty significant poleward shifts in all seasons for both of these summary statistics. And I'll point out that that's great, it's interesting, and it's not really unexpected. However, the rates of change are not necessarily the same. And so here I've sort of just fit pretty simple linear models just for the purpose of visualization. And so in the summer, the centroid has shifted, roughly 330 kilometers, whereas the trailing edge has shifted, almost double, 581 kilometers. And so that suggests that, not only is their distribution changing, not only is their range shifting, but the shape and the size of that distribution is changing as well, which has pretty significant implications in terms of, how much area they have available to them. And then sort of on the other end of the spectrum, in winter, the centroid has shifted almost 660 kilometers, which is roughly an order of magnitude further than that trailing edge at only 66 kilometers. And so, this might suggest sort of a range expansion in winter for the short-beak common dolphins. And then, like I mentioned, I wanted to contrast that with harbor porpoises. And if you're familiar with harbor porpoises, they're at the northeast extent sort of the U.S. waters. And so here I'm again plotting sort of a 4-year bin animation, and it's pretty clear that there's really no change in their distribution in terms of their centroid, their trailing edge, things like that. However, what you might notice is that sort of the colors are sort of fading over time. If we cycle back to the beginning, you'll see that as we get into the latest year bin, the colors are less and less bright. And so we thought, okay, what if we kind of just looked at the abundance, sort of sum those values and look at changes. And what we notice is that the abundance in summer, that's what that last figure is from, has decreased quite substantially. And so you can see their abundance in the earliest year bin was almost 160,000, and it's dropped all the way down to 40,000. And I will say, we have not done a rigorous analysis. I'm sure should be very large confidence intervals around those dots, but this is where we are right now. And on the other side, right, you have increases in winter, right? And so this could suggest a seasonal shift in habitat use for harbor porpoises. Maybe they're spending more time in Canadian waters in more recent times, and they're spending more time in U.S. waters in winter. And so, of course, this is a wind conference, and so I wanted to look at how their habitat overlapped with wind farm lease areas. And so going back to those sort of 4 year bends for short-beaked common dolphin, here I've just plotted the core habitat, and so it's basically just the top 20 or 10% of their range maps. And here the blue just represents that core habitat, and then the gold colors represent those wind lease areas that we're all intimately familiar with at this point, and then the red indicates where those areas overlap. And I think it's super interesting. You can see in the earliest year bend in the top left, you see pretty substantial overlap east of the Chesapeake Bay. But then as that trailing edge kind of contracts poleward, sort of disappears up towards New Jersey, you can see that overlap pretty much goes away. On the other hand, you have those wind lease areas south of Cape Cod, east of Montauk. You can see that the overlap sort of increases a little bit. Again, this is sort of just a first pass analysis. I'm just plotting them together and seeing what I note. But I think it's really interesting. You can see that not only is there is overlap occurring, but it's not constant over time. It's not consistent over time, excuse me. And then again, just to contrast with the harbor porpoise, not surprising, their distribution is sort of limited to the northeast extent, and there's not many wind farm planting areas up there. And so given their distribution isn't really changing, it looks like they are sort of safe from any potential interactions with wind lease areas, at least for now. And so just sort of to conclude, I only focus on these 2 species here, but I will say that we have seen habitat shifts for several species of small odontocetes, for most of the 6 that we've seen, that we've studied. And also, the abundance of harbor porpoise, at least sort of as it currently stands, looks like it's declined in the northeast in summer and potentially increased in winter, suggesting, potentially a seasonal shift in when and how much they spend time here in those different seasons. And then, of course, the core habitat for these 2 species, at least, we do see overlap for short-beaked common dolphin and for some of the other species as well, but it's not consistent over time. And so, potentially, if we have species that are overlapping with wind lease areas now, that may not be the same in the next 5 years and the next 10 years. Or if you have species now that don't show any overlap, it's something we can consider as those species potentially might be shifting up the coast. And as we saw yesterday, there's lots of sort of research on wind farms in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. If we have harbor porpoises spending more time in Canadian waters, that could be a potential risk for them as well if they're spending more time up there near those wind lease areas. And so I just want to thank my advisor, Dr. Leslie Thorne, and my lab mates as well, and thank all of you for listening to my talk.
While I'm setting up the next speaker, just a reminder to folks to open your app and ask some questions. I see a few questions are coming in, but just a reminder for that. We still have 2 more talks. So next up, we have Julia Stepanuk, and I apologize if I pronounced the last name incorrectly. Subseasonal forecast is a powerful tool for dynamic mammal monitoring and management.
Okay, thank you very much, and thanks everybody for joining today. I'm going to describe some work that I did as part of my dissertation here at Stony Brook University in Dr. Leslie Thorne's lab. So we've got a trend going here already. So to effectively manage marine species, there's some aspect of risk mitigation that needs to occur. And this involves looking at some of these species, figuring out which ones are impacted, where they're distributed, and when they're there. Now, for highly mobile marine species, this type of monitoring and management can be especially difficult. Static spatial management is sort of a classic approach to looking at how to best come up with areas of high risk that you could close off maybe during certain times of the year in order to try to lower risk. However, this might not work well for maybe highly migratory species or species that are undergoing impacts from climate change, maybe undergoing distribution shifts or habitat use changes, kind of like what we saw in Nathan's talk just now. Today I'm going to present a case study using marine mammals. Now, there's a whole host of anthropogenic risks for marine mammals, including risk of vessel strike, entanglements in fishing gear, acoustic impacts, and then impacts from offshore energy development. Near real-time predictions and distribution modeling can help us inform where some of these high-use or high-risk areas are for marine mammals. So an example of this is Elliot Hazen's work from 2016 looking at blue whales and their susceptibility to risk of vessel strike from shipping vessels in California. Now, what they did was they brought in a host of environmental covariates, built a model, and those covariates were restricted to sort of the most recent previous month. And they were able to look back and present a monthly likelihood of occurrence for blue whales that they could consider in terms of management moving forward or areas of risk to consider moving forward. However, this method still sort of infers potential future considerations based on recent environmental conditions. And we were interested in looking at whether we could anticipate future anthropogenic conflict with marine mammals using climatological forecasts. This work was published in 2023 in Frontiers in Ecology and the Environment. I recommend you please check it out, and I'm happy to answer any questions about that paper later on. So in order to do this, we need a forecast. We primarily used the Sub-X forecast group products. This is from NOAA's Modeling, Analysis, Predictions, and Projections program. This group produces subseasonal predictions of various surface and atmospheric environmental covariates. And the subseasonal period here is on the scale of days to weeks, so sort of in the 1 to 5 week scale. Here, though they have a whole host of environmental covariates, they're primarily atmospheric covariates, so we just focused on sea surface temperature for the purposes of this exercise. The sea surface temperature layers that the Sub-X project produces includes a set of hindcasts where they retroactively apply their model to time periods from 1999 to 2015, and then they started initiating forecasts, in 2017. These forecasts were released a maximum of every 7 days, and then every 7 days you get a daily forecast that leads out 32 to 45 days in the future. Our goal was to use this to incorporate into distribution models of humpback whale abundance in regions of importance for management in the Northeast United States. Humpback whales, short background, they can be up to about 18 meters in length. They migrate to the Gulf of Maine, and as we're also learning, various other parts of the Northeast United States in summer months to feed. And in the Northeast United States, they primarily occupy continental shelf waters. Specific impacts to humpback whales at this time are mortality primarily due to entanglements and vessel strikes. The level of mortality that's currently existing is under federal investigation through an unusual mortality event due to these sort of elevated levels of strandings that have been seen. In addition, there is offshore wind development currently underway on the East Coast. There's planning and development. There's a few projects under construction, as we all know. And then most of these projects are also focused on looking at pre-construction monitoring and site characterization at this time. I want to note that we're not necessarily focusing on any impacts that no impacts from any of this stuff has led to any marine mammal death or serious injury, but we're looking more at sort of the monitoring of any impacts to these animals that may occur. And I did want to flag and do a shout out to the subcommittee for whale communications that was developed in 2023 from the eTwig, and we've released an FAQ document for stakeholders to be able to use that has varying levels of detail that answers a number of questions that can be used to help sort of disseminate some of the scientific information. So, we are focused on marine mammal monitoring and mitigation, looking to minimize non-lethal impacts, which is paramount for permitting, monitoring, and compliance with requirements. Current monitoring and mitigation activities could include passive acoustic monitoring, including human observers on vessels, temporal and speed restrictions, and mitigation during sound-generating activities. Here, we're suggesting or proposing a situation where we could reduce activity at times and locations where whales are forecasted to be in high density with about 1 to 2 weeks notice that could inform minimization of risk. Now to do this, we have to build a humpback whale density model, then we have to assess how good the forecast actually is, and then we bring the forecast into the model and make a bunch of predictions, and then I've gone and assessed this forecast for a wind area of interest. So thank you, Nathan, for already describing the line transect survey data. This is a data set that was collected 1992 onwards. I used data collected from 1998 to 2016. It is both shipboard and aerial survey data where post hoc statistical analyses have been conducted by Jason Roberts and co. at Duke in order to provide a corrected estimate of abundance. I then took this estimate of abundance and created, as you've heard, a generalized additive model, which is where you relate this abundance to a whole host of environmental variables in a modeling framework. The covariates that I chose were important in this forecasting context, so I chose static variables like depth, distance to shore, and bottom slope, But the only dynamic variable I included was sea surface temperature and a couple of derived products. And this is because the only forecast available was for sea surface temperature. If in the future we had a forecast for chlorophyll or eddy formation or something like that, that's something we could bring in the future, but as of right now, sea surface temperature is how we built the model. So, how good is the sea surface temperature forecast? If we look here, we have a map of the Gulf of Maine with a 1-week forecast, a 2-week forecast, and a 3-week forecast. So that's forecasting 1 week, 2 week, 3 week out. And we've just done a simple correlation between the forecast and satellite sea surface temperature for a given historical time period. The higher values, which are in darker blue, indicate better agreement than the yellow values, which represent lower agreement. So here we can see that week 3 is pretty low agreement overall, so that might be something that we wouldn't want to incorporate. In addition, you can see that there's grid cells that are shared between land and water, and those have relatively low skill as well. And so for the purposes of this exercise, we focused on a forecast 1 week out into the future. You can also see the grid cells here are relatively large when you're looking at the Gulf of Maine. And so we brought in a statistical downscaling process in order to use a reference sea surface temperature data set to downscale from 1 decimal degree to 0.2 decimal degrees. Then we basically just took that finalized forecast layer, swapped it out with the sea surface temperature layer that was inside of the GAM, and created a prediction surface that ended up being a humpback whale forecast. We also found that these forecasts performed similarly well compared to the satellite-based prediction surfaces that we produced as a verification. Now, moving into the context of offshore wind, what does this look like for the Gulf of Maine? So this is an analysis that I did a little bit ago. So this was the main original area of interest that was used in some of the preliminary sighting that eventually ended up with what is now the research array. The values here represent the number of humpback whales per 100 kilometers squared. The top row is 2018. The bottom row is 2020. And you can see these are maps for April 10, 17, 24, and May 1st, respectively. Importantly, the April 10 maps would have been released on April 3rd, so you would have them a week ahead of time. Here you can see that there's differences between years. So 2018, there was a drastic increase in forecasted arrival of humpback whales starting on April 24. And then in 2020, you can see that it's a much more gradual increase, but there is an increase documented over time. Importantly, we're not necessarily recommending that this would be some sort of replacement for monitoring, but it could be a tool for decision-making for sort of trying to figure out where and when you might want to target activities for any sort of marine mammal impact generating activities. So in conclusion, this is a first step that shows how subseasonal forecasts could be used to predict distributions of highly mobile marine species. This is also a relatively generalizable framework. It could be generalized to different species, different types of ecological models, different management scenarios in different regions. There's a couple of future improvements that could be made here. One would be wanting to move forward maybe into integrating near real-time or real-time data into the model. And also looking at some of the improvements that are consistently being made within the SubX framework, particularly looking at things like multi-models or bringing in other covariates. With that, I would like to thank all of my collaborators and co-authors, the marine mammal observers and data collectors, and the agencies that support SubX, as well as the SubX modeling groups. Thank you.
All right, our final speaker, he needs really no introduction. If you need densities, he's the guy to go to. So up next, we have Jason Roberts to talk about near real-time North Atlantic right whale density models.
Thanks, Laura. All right, so as mentioned, I'm here to talk about a new project that we have started up recently that's a near real-time density model for North Atlantic right whales. My co-author on this talk is Pat Halpin, who's not here, but as we'll see, there are many, many people who are active participants in this whole process, and I'll acknowledge them as we go along. So we've just heard a couple of presentations about some of the things that we want to know. So Stakeholders and managers want to know at their locations of interest, which might be wind energy areas, for example, how many right whales are usually there and what times of year. So that's kind of a retrospective look. How many right whales are there right now? And that's more of a situational awareness type of look. And then as we just saw with Julia's presentation, how many might be there tomorrow or next week, next month, next season, next year? So these are related questions, but we have kind of different ways of looking at them. Julia just mentioned one of the challenges we have looking in the future is we don't have the kind of covariates in the future that we might want to have to model these species. So we kind of attack them a little differently. So first let me talk briefly about this one. So this is something that we've been working on for a long time. We have a series of marine mammal density models for the U.S. East Coast that include right whales along with 30 other taxa. And so the way these models work, as we've seen in the previous two presentations, is we have visual sampling for the species, shipboard and aerial surveys that are flown by scientific organizations. We link those data with ocean observations in a statistical model, and then from that, we predict the model through time across the long-term archive of oceanographic data to come out, in this particular case, with monthly forecasts. And then for most decision makers, we've summarized those into long-term monthly averages that they then use for long-term decision making. Here's a picture of a slide that Nathan, I think, showed earlier. There's, in this particular model that we released in 2022, there were 11 collaborating survey teams. This comprised, no doubt, hundreds of people who were participating in this over a long period of time, probably thousands of people. Thank you very much to everyone. Some of the people are in the room on this. As I mentioned, the model framework that we use involves generalized additive models. One thing that we haven't heard about in the previous two presentations too much is there's a prior step that has to happen, which is to correct all of these data so that they can be used together. This is a two-stage model statistically, so we start with the line transects, and then we use something called distance sampling, which corrects for the probability of making a sighting given its distance from the observer and other covariates. So there are large differences between these programs that need to be addressed, and that's addressed in this stage. And then once that's been corrected, then we can go on and fit a spatial model. In this case, we're using GAMS, but you can use, a whole variety of spatial models. Using oceanographic covariates, you can use all kinds of other covariates, such as space and time explicitly, which we do use for certain species. Then after you've done your model checking and diagnostics, then you can take the archive of covariates and then plumb it through the fitted model and make predictions. Here's what the predictions look like along with the survey data that was used to fit the model for North Atlantic right whale. Here I'm showing the predictions summarized over the entire duration of the study, which is for most months 2003 through 2020. Some data was used actually from 1999 and later in August and September, but that's not labeled on this figure here. So you can see as time progresses through the season, in winter, right whales are found essentially across the coast. And then as spring progresses, they move northward, north of Cape Hatteras. And then historically, they're mainly found in Gulf of Maine during summer, and then they return in fall. So this work culminated in a publication here earlier this year. Here's the many co-authors who were part of this. These are primarily the PIs of all of these different survey programs, along with some collaborating experts who assisted with the development of this model. But as I said, many, many people took part in this project, and thank you all. In terms of management applications, these are long-term monthly averages. And so these are suitable for situations where you want to use the long-term view of the past essentially as a proxy for what the future might be, not tomorrow, but for a relatively longer period of time, such as several years. And so these get incorporated into things that are like, time area mitigations and rules that are going to apply that are not going to be dynamic. So we kind of talk about these mostly as static mitigations. So some examples where this has been used is in NOAA's development of fishery rules, the LMA1 closure, for example, that was defined before Congress and the President put the kibosh on developing new fishing rules until 2029. That was developed with this. NOAA's proposed speed zones, those were developed based on this model. The wind energy folks, of course, know about the IHAs and LOAs. They have to develop many of those. I think all of those were developed based on these data here. And then the Navy, of course, who's been a major funder of this density modeling work, they have based all of their models on this as well. And there are other examples of this. So that's kind of a look in the past, but we also have these two questions, which are the now and are the future. And so we had Julia address the question of the future. I'm not going to talk about that right now. What I would like to do going forward is to first attack the question of how do we handle the right now, and then how do we handle an important problem that Julia brought up, which is that there's just a lot of coordination and plumbing and engineering that has to happen to address the right now that you need to have in order to address the future as well. So here's kind of a compelling example that shows the situation of, why do we need a model to do this? The right whale community together has gathered its data all together into a system called Whale Map that you can go to, that you can view all of the sightings, including systematic and non-systematic, so-called opportunistic sightings, acoustic detections, and then also all this survey effort when it's available. And so here you can see, this general region that we're in right now, and 4 years. Sorry, I don't have 2024 in here. I probably should have put 2024 in here because it's a very interesting year. But as you can see, there are a number of areas throughout the region where basically during these spring months, we just don't have any sampling at all by any platform. And so this leads to major questions about what's going on in those regions. And so if you're in that region, you can look at whale map data. This is for a 3-month period of time. Basically, you're left to kind of mentally integrate. You make your own model. You look at what kind of sightings have been there, how much effort was there, and you think, okay, do we think there are right whales there or not? And so what we want to do is we want to move beyond that so that we can systematically put these data together, and the community can talk about how do we best make that kind of prediction so that we don't have everybody making their own kind of mental guesses about what's going on. So one particularly interesting location is this area right here, the shelf off Hudson Canyon. As you can see, we haven't had any sampling there at all during these 3 previous years. And we had a little bit of sampling there last year, and lo and behold, we did get some detections in this area. And this area, over the past few weeks, has been a major hotspot for right whales. And historically, that is an unknown area where we just haven't had much sampling. So it's hard to say whether or not that's a new thing or an old thing. My own gut feeling is it's probably mostly maybe a new thing, maybe related to some of the oceanographic changes that we've been talking about, and so I'm highly interested in that. But I suspect that right whale density there has never been zero, even heading into summer like this over the past years. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to build now a near real-time density model. And so we start with the same kind of overall process, but one thing that we really need to do is to incorporate acoustics. This is a complicated topic, and I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A session if you want. But suffice to say, we really need to do this, and so we're going to take some steps in this direction. Once we have those data, we need a model that can, sorry, it's hard for me to read my own text, that can assimilate new oceanographic, visual, and acoustic data without refitting the model, right? So we don't have time to go through an extensive model fitting exercise. We need to make predictions on a much higher frequency, so potentially daily predictions. The frequency that we use, we need to talk about what should that be, what would be helpful to people depending on the management application, and then also what's feasible given the data that we have available. We need to assess skill using a technique that's both suitable for informing people based on management application and that also reflects how we're actually going to make predictions. And then use that to refine models, and then eventually we'll select a model that will be put into operation. And then when that model is in operation, we need to be able to plumb these data through very rapidly and make an ongoing series of nowcasts, and then hopefully, if methods allow, forecasts, and then assess the skill of that as we're progressing. So this is going to involve the work of a lot of people in the community. And so here, this is kind of like what we have right now. What we need to do is to gather the opinions and the help of collaborating modelers. We do that to some degree now. Species experts, we do that to some degree, and managers and stakeholders. So this part of the process will continue where they will provide guidance in these other things. In terms of the outputs, if this is fully realized, will be used by everyone from the general public to app developers, potentially can use the results to data portals, which is something that we do right now, to downstream modelers, which is also something that's done right now. NOAA's decision support tool for entanglement reductions is one example of that. We also want to continue what we've been doing now and actually boost what we've been doing, which is to continue to provide prepped data to other modelers. So as we've heard in the previous two presentations, which were based on the work that we've done, it's not enough just to collect the data. It's not even enough to just get the data all together like onto one hard drive. You actually have to do a lot of work to standardize the data to make it usable in one final statistical model. So Julia and Nathan have had the luxury of basically me providing them with a big data frame that they can then just start modeling with. And the amount of work by the people before me and then by our team to put that data frame together for them to use is huge. And so we want to continue to do that and actually make it more automated so even more people can take advantage of this. This will allow other folks to continue to push forward with things like they're doing and even to suggest new models that we can then incorporate into a system like this. So the ultimate goal is for this to grow into a community-based kind of modeling system if we can do it. And then finally, we need to continue to move forward on methods development that will allow us to incorporate things like opportunistic sightings and then data collected by PSOs. This is going to require some heavy lifting when it comes to statistical methodology, but people are interested in this and it's a problem that's going to be worked on. So thanks very much. Again, I just want to thank everybody who's been involved in this. And I look forward to, in the future, as this project gets going, presenting results from it. But as I said, today it's just getting started, and it will be a 4-year project starting this summer. Thank you.
Test. Right, it's loud. So thank you, Jason. This has been a passion project of mine to see this concept come to fruition, and I think we have all the right people in the room to make it happen. It needs a name, Jason. He's not listening to me. You need to come up with a name, Jason, for it. But we've had a lot of questions come in, so let me open those up. I just lost it. And I am going to start with one for Julia and Jason. Have you ground truthed your observations of the humpbacks, and have you tried forecasting, then checking your observations from a week later to see how accurate it was? And then, Jason, if you have any thoughts to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. We tried. We tried hard. So the way that we approached this sort of model development wasn't necessarily looking at what's the best set of covariates you could include to make a really good density distribution map of humpback whales, like what Jason has worked so hard on. It was more, what are the covariates that are important to look at arrival of humpback whales to this area? And so we were looking at things like spring transition, sea surface temperature change. I did look at some sort of like lead times and teleconnections and things like that. And the problem with getting those data to look at arrival is you need to be surveying prior to when the whales are there, and we found that from year to year that was just incredibly difficult to do for the spatial scale that we were looking at. If I had eternal time in graduate school and endless sort of opportunities to maybe pull in some of the whale map detections and try and use those to sort of test this, that would be something that I would be interested in looking into in the future, but it's not something that I incorporated.
That's a really good question, and it's something that's super critical for a project like the one that I'm talking about, the near real-time model. So for that, there are at least a couple of things that we want to do. One is something called time series cross-validation, where essentially, let's say we decide to do that model on a daily basis. You would fit the model and predict the model based on all of the information available to a certain date. And then you would use, say, for example, the next day worth of data to check it. And then you would keep predicting the model forward, checking it against the next day, and then refitting the model according to whatever cadence you think is realistic. And so that way, in essence, you're using whatever's happening in the future as your evaluation point for whatever the model information you allow it to have up until that period of time. And so a lot of it depends on how quickly we can get data propagated into the model. That's one of the central questions. The whale map team has a lot of information that we could potentially use to evaluate that question, but I just want to put a thank you out to everybody who's involved in the wind community who is gathering data and trying to propagate that data quickly to groups like Whale Map. That's going to be essential for projects like this. Because as we've seen, some of the acoustic results, for example, are showing that right whales aren't necessarily persistent in certain areas for really long periods of time. And so that will make it critical to get data quickly out in the form of predictions.
So before we move from this topic, because this is something I've thought a lot about, I'm familiar with Whale Safe. Jason, I don't know if you've looked at that. And can you just speak to that briefly? And how that functions and how what you're suggesting
sure.
functions.
So Whale Safe is an application where people can report sightings of whales that they've seen. And so under this framework here, that would be something that we would call an opportunistic sighting. And that's, again, something where we need to do some statistical work in order to incorporate those. But assuming that you have, a good fully identified sighting, that can qualify as a point where at some time the animals were present, right? And so that can inform a density surface, and then once predictions are made, those predictions can actually be rolled back into applications like that. So if someone's actually using that to kind of monitor what's going on, they can use a model prediction as part of the thinking that they have.
Great, thank you. So the next question, this is stayed at the top the whole time, Nathan. Are your methods easily transferable to other regions? Looking at the harbor porpoise model results, it would be interesting to examine potential changes in Canadian waters further north.
Yeah, so great question, and very happy that it was asked. I would say, yes, it can be very easily transferable. I would say you can't just take my model and extend it because, as Jason referred to, there is an explicit spatio-temporal component that's specifically using kind of the east coast of the U.S. But the models are actually fairly straightforward. For harbor porpoise, I think there's only 5 or 6 oceanographic covariates, and then as long as you sort of bake in, latitude and longitude, presuming you're looking at, Newfoundland or, Nova Scotia, sorry, you could pretty straightforward, take the same exact model methods and apply them there. I guess the last thing I'll say is that I mentioned I had 4 year bins for the models that I developed. That is always a balance between having enough information to sort of look at changes over time while not over-parameterizing the model and trying to sort of have, for example, you couldn't do it with only 2 years. There probably wouldn't be enough data, enough sightings sort of within that year bin for the model to be trustworthy. And so, short answer, yes, I think it could definitely be done. And I don't think it would be super difficult. It just depends on how much data is available.
Great. Next question for Evan. Given your study findings, do you think there are more spatial and temporal mismatches happening between seabird distributions and the distributions of their prey?
Well, it certainly seems like some seasons there could be drifting into other directions. I kind of breezed over the spatial temporal correlation side, but a lot of our species relationships stayed relatively stable. There was some cycling that was happening, but they weren't moving too much when we were comparing the spatial temporal correlations over the study period. Certainly. There were some that were shifting pretty considerably, and so whether or not that creates mismatch is like a really complicated question that we need to answer through understanding more changes in biomass, changes in understanding prey and foraging behaviors and things like that. So it's tough to say whether they're shifting in ways that are going to be, have negative consequences on populations, but they're certainly shifting, and certainly we're seeing that they're not shifting in quite so consistent ways. So I think there's a lot of different factors that are affecting each of these species in different ways, and so it's not just a warming trend that's sending everyone to the north. And so I think there's a lot of complexity. We have a lot of evidence from seabirds on the breeding grounds that they're shifting their prey pretty consistently year after year. We've seen it in the Gulf of Maine a lot. Herring is sometimes really important. Some years it's less important. But some of they still get fish, but sometimes those fish are less energetically helpful to them, and they can affect reproductive success. So I think the consequences of those mismatches are going to be hard to assess outside of the breeding season, but I think those are some of the challenges we have in front of us.
Great, thank you. This next one is for Chris. Beyond presence of zooplankton in southern New England, can you speak to whether or not dynamics of the area, strong tides and currents over Nantucket shoals, allow right whale prey to aggregate?
Yeah, this is something we're actively working on. So recently we added an ADCP to our ship-based measurements, so it would be collected together with echo sounding and net tows and things like that. So with that, we hope to get a sense of the currents and how they might help aggregate prey. Also related to wind wakes, we're hoping to deploy some ADCPs paired with echo sounders in the general region, and maybe also in that tidal front, deploy those on the bottom, so we can get a better sense of how the two are correlated. I mean, I guess I could give my professional opinion, not necessarily backed up by statistics, that I think the tidal front along the edge of Nantucket shoals can help aggregate prey, and it's also generally a very productive area. So the right whale distribution in that area seems to change seasonally. So for many years, typically January, February, the whales are concentrated in the biggest numbers on the southern end of Nantucket shoals, kind of that southwest corner. And as the season progresses towards spring, they kind of move north and then spread out across west across the wind energy area. So kind of following the dominant current. So I think that also plays a role.
And for those interested in specifically hydrodynamic processes around Nantucket shoals, there is a detailed report that was produced. Chris was part of that. There are several people in the room who participated in that. Josh Cahoot-House, I think, is giving a presentation on it, or has. So if you need more information on that, reach out to us or one of those parties. So the next question is really it was directed for you, Julia, but I think this is a question for everyone. What environmental covariates would be your top pick to collect data on? The question was specifically for the humpback forecast models, but I'm going to ask all of you what would be your top covariate to sample.
Okay, wait, which one are you picking? Okay, yeah. So I'm going to give the cop-out answer, which is that we're using these physical covariates sort of as a proxy, especially in this part of the world, for prey. So I'm going to punt it to the prey modelers and ask them to incorporate all the environmental covariates, make us one nice prey layer that we can incorporate into our models.
So I'll actually sort of refer to Jackie's talk in the last session in this room. I really like the idea of sort of that, aggregation of prey. It sort of takes all these oceanographic features that are included in the model, which are, to be frank, pretty bad predictors by themselves, and they sort of just work as a proxy for, the stuff that's actually going on, things like prey. So I think really large-scale, complex oceanographic features like Jackie sort of talked about would be fantastic, especially all over the East Coast.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. It's hard to pick just one. Some of these variables matter a lot for one species, not a lot for others. One thing that we found that was really interesting in our project when we were looking at forage fish aggregations at the surface through those digital aerial surveys is we found that mixed layer depth and estimate of stratification was really important to predicting forage fish aggregations, like extremely important. And we've known for a while that stratification is quite important for understanding seabird foraging patterns, understanding prey aggregations, and things like that. But it came out so important that I would say it's something that we really need to put some time into thinking about how we can get good estimates of stratification across broad geographic scales. Also, smaller scales are great too, but if we want to do larger scale ecology, macroecology type things, we need to think about how that process works in some useful ways.
Yeah, and similarly, I'd be interested in oceanographic measurements that might drive aggregations of prey, so currents, also the things from Jackie's talk. We have some plans to look into those through Project WOW, some funding for that, and hopefully incorporate some of Jackie's work.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely prey, of course, when it comes to predators. But also, I'll mention a couple of things. One is that these are social animals, both cetaceans and birds. And so there are going to be some dynamics that can't be addressed even if we got, the holy grail of covariates in terms of prey. And then the other thing that I would mention is a problem that Evan mentioned and that we saw in our cetacean talks is that the sampling is, very heterogeneous. And so just for completeness, I'll say if we had, proper systematic sampling at a high enough frequency or stratified random sampling at a high enough frequency, we could just model this purely with space and time. That probably won't be within the resources that society is willing to commit. But the more that we can move in that direction, the less dependent on having the golden covariate we will be.
Great. So this is more of a loaded question, and I recognize that for several of you, this is not really your specialty, but I would recommend, this has been a topic in the news in general, so this was really directed to Nathan, but I, again, asked for others to respond. So what is, with the understanding that there aren't a focal species in your study, any general thoughts about the recent mass stranding of Atlantic white-sided dolphins on Cape Cod in the context of Northeast U.S. warming?
To be honest, this is the first time hearing of it, so I don't really have any thoughts on it.
Okay, good. All right. Give me a second to pop up another one. All right, I'll just pick the one at the top. So, Evan, what is your confidence in the forage fish distribution models given forage fish occupy mainly the middle surface of the water column? Are there plans to supplement these models with other data surveys in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the confidence, we talked about it a little bit. I think we after some preliminary analysis, came to the conclusion that we weren't confident in the biomass estimates. But I think we were reasonably confident in the occupancy estimates. They're detected frequently enough that I think there's some useful information there, hence the work. Data that we need, yeah. So I think there's a lot of small scale data sets that can be really helpful here. And I think actually, if you saw the presentation on the Prepared project from over in the UK in the last session, they gave some really good insight into different ways we can be measuring different sorts of fish populations at offshore wind areas or in other locations. To help inform our understanding of prey biomass in those areas. I think those types of steps are going to be really important. We're working on a project now where we're trying to translate some knowledge from Europe onto benthic change in the Northwest Atlantic. and how that might propagate its effects, like in trophic effects, into higher level predators as an add-on to Project WOW, which I'm a collaborator on. And so I think there's some really good opportunities with that project and some others to start giving some strong recommendations on what kinds of prey data are going to be most useful. Also, I think Chris gave some really good suggestions on types of studies you can do to augment prey distributions. The trick is getting them at scale. If you want to do like larger macroecology work, the cool thing about the DAS, the digital aerial survey work, is you can get large-scale digital aerial survey data. And so I think probably the trick was going to be some kind of figuring out how you can marry large-scale surveys with smaller-scale estimates of prey availability or prey aggregations in a way that like allows you to like upscale what we know from these like smaller-scale studies. But honestly, I haven't thought about that too much. But if people are wanting to talk about that, we could really use some of those data. So I think that could be an interesting collaboration moving forward.
Great. So this next one's a little bit more, I won't say a provocative question, but, and it's okay if you want a way of answering this one. So this is a general question for you all. This work is very interesting, but offshore wind construction vessels are booked years in advance and cost, upwards of $200,000 a day and more. I've worked as a developer for many years, so they're costly. And planning happens years in advance. So can you please help us understand how these data could be integrated into, I would say, development and operation activities for offshore wind?
Sorry, which data could be integrated?
I think in general, like how do you use these modeling outputs to inform activities? Have you given that any thought? Like how do we take the outputs of a model you're talking about and turn that into an action? Like, what does that action look like? What are you thinking that action looks like?
Okay, so I won't profess to be able to tell people how to run a $250,000 a day operation. But in general, what we're talking about here is a situation where there may be adverse impacts on, protected species by some of these operations. So the first thing that we need to understand is, are there adverse impacts? The next thing we need to understand is, what are the spatial and temporal scales kind of that those impacts happen over? And then we can talk about whether or not there could be mitigations. And then we need to talk about what the costs of those mitigations are, and then society needs to do a cost-benefit analysis on those mitigations versus the species. And that's not something that I feel like I can weigh in on. Just as the provider of the density data, we don't advocate on that, right? We're trying to provide neutral density data that other people can use to advocate on that. But if we can get to the bottom of the spatial temporal questions, that's what we're trying to do, is to provide data that can help with that problem.
I guess I've sort of thought of it in the context of maybe having an additional PSO up on the deck, something sort of simplistic like that, where if you know or have an idea that there's going to be a potential increased risk to whatever activity is underway, having additional information on when those may be happening on a scale that's relevant in sort of that kind of decision-making context could be an opportunity for an application of the kind of work that's been presented here.
Okay. Did you want to add to that, Chris?
Sure. I mean, I like both answers. I was thinking more along the lines of what Jason mentioned, and the obvious issue is the timing of the development versus the research. A lot of this research is underway, but we may not have solid results for a few years. So maybe it can impact some areas, but not others quite as well. So it's just we're doing our best to catch up as far as getting the research done in time, but it may be a situation where you learn after it's in the water, but perhaps it could be applied to, if it's general enough, it could be transferred to other areas that still have development to happen.
Yeah, just a quick add-on to those nice answers is, aside from the planning stages, which I think all these data can be useful in kind of a planning context, I think, at least from my perspective, a lot of our work is trying to understand what types of effects are out there and what kind of consequences there are for those things. And that's not going to probably get imported into like the daily operations, though I don't really know how that works either. So, it could go a couple directions, I suppose. But if we can better understand the ecological context of these changes that are happening, so we can start saying like, well, these behavioral changes or these other effects add up to population changes, then we can start making some better and more informed decisions, hopefully, about what kind of effects are happening and how worried we should be about them. And that sort of helps us moving forward. So I don't think, I don't have any plans for near real-time integration of these data into, minute-by-minute decision-making, but who knows, maybe down the line we can get there. But for now, I think we're just trying to understand what sort of effects we're even seeing and what they mean.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys taking a crack at it. I mean, it's something I have to deal with, every day with a developer hat on, but that's the purpose of this conference, is to have these interesting and challenging conversations, but hopefully move the science forward, but also, in my view, advance the development of offshore wind. So we'll get back into the hard science. This is for Nathan, but I think a few of you can answer this question. With such large data sets, would machine learning techniques such as random forest and environmental variables be a good approach for more detailed models that can be used to predict impacts of offshore wind? And anyone can jump in on this. Yeah. I'm reading it verbatim, so I can't interpret exactly what it's saying, but would machine learning techniques such as random forest and environmental variables be a good approach for more detailed models that can be used to predict impacts of offshore wind? I think the general question is, there other modeling approaches that you can take other than what you've done?
Short answer, yes, absolutely. So we all have kind of pie in the sky ideas for what's possible before we start the project. Sort of my original idea was sort of using an ensemble approach. If you're not familiar, you can sort of build a bunch of different models using a bunch of different modeling frameworks. So support vector machine, random forest, Boosted regression trees, things like that, evaluate the model skill on the data used to build the models, and then sort of weight their predictions by the modeling skill and sort of aggregate them together. Every modeling framework has different biases associated with it, and in sort of incorporating them all together, you sort of you can minimize that approach. So yes, I will say GAMs are definitely not the be-all, end-all. So I'm actually super interested in using approaches like VAST, because I think are super useful, especially in the context of sort of unexplainable distribution changes, or distribution changes that we can see but don't know what the drivers are. And I really think the best way to sort of get about that is to use all of them and really compare them in a robust way, standardize them as best they can, say which one is best, or, in the case of ensemble modeling, just weight them by how well they perform and apply those, and sort of be a little bit more confident that you're sort of minimizing the bias of using any one modeling approach.
I'll make 3 comments on this. So what I'll talk about are what are the challenges, and I'm talking to somebody who's familiar with this kind of methodology. So the first thing is, I would say we shouldn't consider this to be a quote-unquote big data problem. Currently, in terms of the data that we're used to fit our model, I can't speak for Evan's model, but we've got about 3 million linear kilometers of data, and the models that we're currently building, we're using 5-kilometer segments, so that's roughly 600,000 records that are used for training, right? So when you're talking about a big data application, you're usually talking about orders of magnitude greater than that. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is that for our 3 presentations on cetaceans, we're modeling density. So that's not a classification problem, that's a regression problem. Most of the methods that have been developed around machine learning tend to be around classification problems. So when you come to regression, you're going to need a new set of tools when it comes to like model evaluation and optimization. Those are out there, but it just means you're dealing with a smaller kind of amount of literature and methods that have been developed. And what was I going to say for the third thing? Sorry, I think I forgot the third thing.
Just one more addition in that, like, machine learning is one of the many tools that we have available. There's nothing particularly special about it. It's just different.
Right.
I will say I don't tend to use it very often, but sometimes it can be quite useful, particularly when you have really complex relationships between covariates and a response you're interested in. Everything Jason said is correct, though. You do get to say the word AI when you're doing your analysis, which has sometimes positive and sometimes negative effects when you are talking to a group of people. So, you can use that effectively. I will say in a more serious note, though, machine learning, I tend to not like how they deal with uncertainty in a lot of machine learning models. It's hard to propagate that uncertainty properly because of the algorithms they used. I much prefer using Bayesian or frequentist methods for those reasons. So there are some costs to trying to get the really fancy squiggly line between sea surface temperature and whatever it is you're interested in.
Right, thanks. That reminds me of the other thing, and actually I'm going to add one more thing. So it's nice for ecologists to have relationships that are interpretable, and it's, as Evan mentioned, it's hard to get interpretable relationships out of many of those methods. And then the second thing is, as stakeholders and users don't like to see edge effects. And so methods that smooth, like the GAM approach that we use, don't end up with edge effects. And so what I'm talking about is, like, density is really high and then suddenly it's really low. Everyone obsesses about that extreme gradient, that line between the two. Why is it there? And so with many tree-based methods that you have in the kind of machine learning-based literature, that can happen sometimes.
So we are out of time there. I encourage you all to take a look at the other questions and where you can reach out to the where their name's listed. There was some questions about data. I just want to say that, for the density models, Jason is constantly updating that, but there are other entities now in the ecosystem of offshore wind in the East Coast, including RWSC and ROSA, that are, as well as the existing network of NERACOOS and MARICOOS and the other regional USs, actively bringing all this data together. This is big data. All of this is big data, and part of the challenge is how you move that data around effectively. There's a cost to it. Data has to be stored. So there's a lot still being worked out in that front. So I think there are questions about specific data streams likely. Jason's already aware of it, but getting it into the model just does take some time. So. But thank you all for this session. This is really exciting. I look forward to this session being featured, and enjoy your lunch.